History often remembers kings as symbols, crowns, portraits, laws etched into stone. But it rarely remembers the quiet rooms where fear first takes root. It forgets the trembling hands, the whispered prayers, the moments when power senses a challenge and turns savage. This is not a story about a battlefield or a throne room. It is a story about a young woman, a vision spoken too loudly, and a king who believed God himself had crowned him. And when faith collided with absolute power, mercy vanished. They claimed the chambers where the holy Maid of Kent received her visions were perfumed with incense and holiness. But no sacred smoke could disguise the truth of what happened within those stone walls. In a narrow cloister at the monastery of Saint Sepulchres, a young woman scarcely past girlhood knelt while attendants lifted her shaking hands toward relics reserved for saints. They told her this was divine favor, heaven's highest calling. She knew otherwise. Her hands trembled not from the cold English air seeping through cracked monastery windows, but from a truth she dared not speak aloud. She was not afraid of death. Death would have been a kindness compared to what awaited her. The monks called her a holy sister, but the title meant nothing. Once her story reached the ears of the king, once it passed into the gaze of the man she would soon face, the man England hailed as God's chosen ruler, she ceased to be human. She became an instrument, and instruments are meant to be used, then broken. The body never lies. Hers told the story clearly. Her spine bent as if burdened by an unseen weight. Her jaw locked tight, as though holding back terror that threatened to spill from within. Her eyes, hollowed by months without rest, looked far older than her years. She had stopped dreaming long before anyone realized. Henry VIII had been born in 1491 into the heart of a rising Tudor dynasty. At the time, England was a wounded kingdom clawing its way out of civil war. Nobles seethed with ambition, the clergy watched uneasily, and the crown itself still felt fragile. From the Welsh borders to the northern shires, rebellion had left scars that had not yet healed. 50 years earlier, the idea of a Tudor king would have seemed unthinkable. But when Henry arrived, his father's court declared him England's golden child, a prince marked by divine favor. He was not raised as a boy. He was raised as a belief. At Eltham Palace, tutors and priests pressed the same message into him endlessly. You are anointed. Your judgment is righteous. Your will is law. They taught him Latin, scripture, music, and warfare, but never humility, never restraint. Every ritual reinforced his sanctity. At morning prayers, chaplains murmured blessings for his soul. At meals, servants knelt as they poured his wine. Courtiers moved with calculated reverence, never turning their backs, never speaking without consent. He was not merely royal. He was almost sacred. When a child grows believing God has chosen him, mercy begins to look like weakness. His grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, the iron spine of the Tudor line, hardened that belief. A survivor of plots, exile, and bloodshed, she whispered to Henry that only total control ensured survival. Love, she taught him, must be commanded. Loyalty must be enforced. By the time the crown settled on his head at 27, Henry believed England was his body and its people his veins. Subjects and saints alike were expendable. Both existed to serve his will. His early reign burned with ambition. He marched against France, crushed northern uprisings, bent Parliament until it echoed his desires. The message was brutally clear: defy him, and divine punishment would follow. Yet his greatest challenge did not come from armies, but from faith itself. For Henry, Rome was not merely a political obstacle. It was a personal affront. Breaking with the Pope meant placing himself above every altar in England. He ordered scholars to tear through Scripture in search of justification. Priests who hesitated were silenced. And when Rome refused his request for annulment, Henry crossed a line no king before him had dared approach. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. Monasteries were stripped of gold. Abbots were cast aside. Centuries of sacred tradition were dissolved overnight. His supporters called it reform. Others called it desecration. Then the visions began. Whispers spread from Kent of a young nun slipping into trances. At St. Sepulchre's Priory, a woman barely in her 20s collapsed into fits, her voice emerging thick with warnings she claimed came from heaven itself. She proclaimed that God condemned the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn, that England would suffer, that death shadowed a monarch who defied divine law. For the first time, a ruler who called himself untouchable felt fear. And when a king who believes himself chosen by God feels threatened, he does not withdraw, he escalates. Henry returned to London in fury. Celebrations ceased. Banquets fell silent. Foreign envoys were dismissed. Courtiers noticed his eyes constantly darting toward doors, as if treachery lurked behind every arch. His orders grew sharper, colder, unrestrained. Hesitant priests were imprisoned. Nuns who repeated the Maid of Kent's words were tortured. England, once ruled through councils and ceremony, buckled beneath paranoia. But the darkest shift occurred in the cloister where Elizabeth Barton once prayed. What began as a humble claim of spiritual calling transformed into a fixation of a crown. Bishops arrived. Interrogators followed. Monks vanished without explanation. Her visions, once revered, became evidence. Her trances, once sacred, were recast as crimes. The girl who believed she spoke with angels found herself trapped inside the nightmare of a king who could not endure any voice louder than his own. The quiet priory in Kent, once a refuge of fasting and prayer, became the epicenter of a national storm. Pilgrims poured in. Priests carried her warnings like burning embers across the realm. Noblemen whispered her prophecies over candlelit tables. Elizabeth Barton was no longer merely a sister. She had become a symbol, a crack in the foundation of England's fractured church. At Lambeth Palace, where interrogation replaced contemplation, her transformation was completed. She was no longer treated as a visionary, but dismantled like a dangerous device. The holiness that once protected her now clung to her as a curse, a scent of threat that drew the king's wrath closer with every breath she took. Behind those locked doors stood monks, priests, widows, and servants accused of nothing more than listening. Men from Kent, Essex, Canterbury, villages Henry would never set foot in, were dragged into questioning. Each week, new names filled the commissioners' ledgers. The air reeked of damp wool, candle smoke, and fear. Prayers murmured endlessly. No one left those halls unchanged. Her companions, the monks who once guided her, were broken under interrogation. One by one, their testimonies collapsed. Miracles spoken of with pride twisted into confessions of manipulation. Some recanted from terror. Others did so to avoid the rack. No woman of God could survive men who served both the crown and the gallows. Years later, the records preserved by Thomas Cromwell would chronicle what he claimed unfolded inside those walls. His testimony became the frame through which everything else was judged. It shaped the official story, sealed her fate, and poisoned her name for generations. Cromwell later wrote that the turning point came in 1533, the year Henry resolved to place a crown upon Anne Boleyn's head. That, he claimed, was the moment the nun crossed a boundary no subject could survive. She invoked divine judgment, and in doing so, her words transformed into treason. At the heart of the crisis stood a single prophecy, spoken during a trance, repeated by clergy, carried by whispers through villages and halls alike. If Henry took Anne Boleyn as his wife, he would die within the year. No scholar dared defend the vision. No priest could pretend not to understand its implication. And no king could forgive it. From that moment, sincere spiritual concern curdled into royal fixation. Henry became convinced that the nun threatened more than his throne. She endangered his eternal soul. If the people believed her, his authority over church, kingdom, and heaven itself would fracture. And so preparations began. executed with the cold discipline of sacred right. Royal commissioners were dispatched to Canterbury. They entered the priory without blades, bearing instead parchment, seals, and royal warrants. Their tools looked harmless. Their purpose was fatal. Letters were seized, relics confiscated, novices interrogated. Every recorded vision was transcribed, every pilgrim traced, every supposed miracle catalogued with clinical precision. The sisters were told they were assisting a lawful inquiry, an obligation owed to God's anointed king. No one warned them what this inquiry truly was. That winter stripped away the final restraint Henry possessed. The lively prince once known for hunting, music, and grand display faded from view. In his place rose a ruler whose rage never slept, whose fears shouted louder than counselors, whose obsession with control engulfed court and cloister alike. This had never been about heresy. It was about domination. The moment monarchy fused perfectly with fear, consuming every life trapped between them. By early 1534, England no longer resembled the realm it had been. The royal court, once radiant with ceremony, echoed with unease. Inside the Tower and the Archbishop's halls, a new order took hold, bureaucratic, exacting, merciless. Those connected to the Maid of Kent were inventoried like contraband. Names, ages, origins, all inked into depositions stacked inside Cromwell's chests. Influential clerics were summoned to London. Others disappeared into distant prisons. Rank offered no protection. Sanctity offered none at all. A friar from Canterbury met the same fate as a parish priest from Essex. In this New England, innocence carried no weight. Only obedience mattered. Under Cromwell's direction, the investigation took on a relentless structure. Nothing escaped the record. Nothing was forgotten. Meanwhile, Henry continued to bend scripture to his will. Monks who once praised Elizabeth's visions vanished into cells. Some emerged broken, pale, unrecognizable. Others did not return at all. Survival demanded compliance. Truth became whatever the commissioners required. Yet no one endured the cruelty more painfully than Elizabeth Barton herself. She had lived in a world where visions were sacred and obedience to God unquestioned. She believed her trances were real. She believed her warnings came from heaven. But the men who judged her believed in only one truth, the king's. Their silence in the face of her suffering was not faith. It was terror given human form. The church that once sheltered her now became an instrument of her destruction. Clerics who had protected her recited accusations written for them. The circle tightened around monks, nuns, parish priests, anyone reckless enough to believe that God might speak through a woman. Cromwell documented everything. Every confession, every hesitation, every crack in her voice. Later, he claimed her destruction preserved England's stability, fulfilled the king's will, protected the realm from chaos. The truth was simpler. Elizabeth Barton had spoken words Henry VIII could not endure. And in a kingdom where the monarch declared himself the voice of God, no crime was deadlier than contradiction. By spring of 1534, fear seeped into every corner of England's religious life. Priests paused before sermons, weighing every phrase. Monasteries grew quiet after dusk, their cloisters heavy with unease rather than prayer. Even villagers understood the danger now. The Maid of Kent was no longer merely a holy woman. She was a test, a measure of loyalty, a trap baited with faith. Henry watched closely. His youthful warmth had hardened into a sharp, restless gaze, both triumphant and afraid. He had defied Rome, seized the church, crowned and bullion. Yet nothing disturbed him more than a woman from Kent claiming heaven opposed him. Clergy who refused the oath of supremacy vanished. Monks signed declarations under threat of starvation. The Church of England, newly forged by parliamentary decree, trembled beneath a king who demanded not just obedience, but reverence. Elizabeth's prophecies became the mirror in which Henry glimpsed the outline of his own downfall. Rumor carried her words faster than royal edicts. Through sermons, taverns, and whispered fear, she became an enemy he could not silence with force alone. Her destruction turned into necessity, political, spiritual, personal. The interrogations tightened. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer attempted restraint first. He questioned her gently, hoping she would recant and spare England another martyr. Elizabeth refused. Her visions were real, her warnings righteous, her conscience unbroken. Cranmer withdrew. Cromwell advanced. What followed unfolded behind guarded doors where daylight rarely entered. Barton faced men uninterested in truth. They wanted surrender. Hours blurred into days. Her trances ceased. Her strength faded. Her voice thinned beneath, questioning crafted to crush, not understand. Cromwell's record from those sessions changed everything. He claimed she confessed, that her visions were staged, that monks coached her, that her trances were illusions born of ambition. Whether she ever spoke those words, or they were placed in her mouth by fear, has been swallowed by time. The paper survives. The truth does not. With that confession sealed, destruction moved swiftly. Monks became conspirators. Priests became traitors. Parishioners became suspects. Spiritual devotion was rebranded as rebellion. Absolute power requires accomplices, and Henry found many. Nobles hungry for monastic land endorsed his wrath. Ambitious clerics advanced by condemning their peers. Parliament passed laws with shaking hands. Bishops supplied theology to excuse vengeance. Some went further, preaching that resistance to Henry was resistance to God. Elizabeth was declared deluded, possessed, dangerous, her holiness erased, her humanity dismissed. The king's physicians tended to her, not to heal, but to preserve her long enough to die properly. They masked bruises, dulled pain, kept her alive for execution. Their Latin notes concealed torment behind polite phrases. But the deepest betrayal came from the church itself. Friars who once defended her denounced her from pulpits. Priests who had believed her visions repeated court-crafted lies. The faith that had once sheltered Elizabeth Barton consumed her, turning devotion into an instrument of ruin. Cromwell later claimed her final days were calm, that she accepted her fate as a political necessity, that she understood she would die as a warning, not a martyr. Those who guarded the tower whispered otherwise. They said she moved like a shadow, her body stiff with exhaustion, that her eyes reflected neither fear nor surrender, only grief, that her prayers were not for herself, but for England, a kingdom unraveling beneath the weight of a king who could not bear to be challenged. By the opening months of 1534, the direction of events was no longer reversible. The King's Council reached a unanimous conclusion. The Maid of Kent could not simply be hidden away, nor left to decay in a cell. She had to be erased, silenced completely. Her death would serve as a lesson, sharper and more permanent than any royal decree ever issued. The sentence was assembled carefully. Accusations refined, charges drafted with deliberate precision. Treason was chosen as the weapon, for treason demanded death without the burden of proof. Elizabeth Barton would be transformed from miracle into menace, from vessel of divine vision into a living warning. England prepared itself for judgment. The day arrived under a sky heavy with stillness, as though the kingdom itself were holding its breath. London stirred to the sound of church bells, not in celebration, but summoning the city to witness punishment. The council selected the most degrading fate possible: public execution at Tyburn, the notorious crossroads where traitors were stripped of dignity before death. Henry was not satisfied with ending her life. He wanted her erased. On April 20th, 1534, Elizabeth Barton was led from the tower. She wore the habit that had once crowned her with sanctity, now repurposed as part of the king's spectacle. Chains clinked as guards escorted her to the cart that would carry her through the streets. Her body appeared frail, her face drained of color. Yet witnesses noted something unsettling in her gaze, a calm clarity that rattled even the soldiers tasked with delivering her to death. Thomas Cromwell followed at a distance, his face unreadable. For him, this moment contained no anger. It was calculation, executed flawlessly, a necessary offering to secure royal supremacy. As the procession crept through Cheapside, crowds gathered in growing numbers. Some watched in stunned silence. Others whispered prayers into sleeves. A few knelt as she passed, knowingly risking punishment. Rumors spread that she had foreseen this end, that she accepted her fate as part of a divine design. But the loudest voices were those of the king's heralds. They proclaimed her a fraud, a deceiver, an enemy of order. Their accusations, treason, sedition, false prophecy, had been crafted with lethal precision, words heavy enough to crush memory itself. At Tyburn, the triangular gallows towered above the crowd, a wooden monument to royal terror. Elizabeth was positioned beneath it alongside monks and priests accused of standing with her. As custom allowed, she was granted a final moment to speak. Those present later swore her voice did not waver. She made no retraction. She offered no defense. She prayed only that God might show mercy to England. It was not the confession Henry desired, but it was the last dignity she retained. At the signal, the ropes were pulled. Her body rose sharply. Her limbs trembled. The habit twisted around her as life drained away. A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. The Maid of Kent, once revered as a miracle, now hung suspended, consumed by the machinery of a king who could not tolerate her voice. When it ended, the bodies were cut down and disposed of without honor. No prayers, no markers, no relics. Henry ordered her name struck from church records. Her priory dissolved. Her companions scattered or silenced. The machinery of suppression advanced with ruthless efficiency. Monks were executed or imprisoned. Priests warned. Pilgrims watched. Witnesses monitored. No poet celebrated her. No chronicler dared defend her. Even bishops who once praised her visions now echoed the king's version of events as unquestioned truth. The church that had sheltered her abandoned her to save itself. For centuries, history focused elsewhere, on Henry's break with Rome, on and Boleyn's coronation, on acts of parliament that reshaped a nation. The young woman who had dared speak against the king was relegated to the margins, swallowed by political triumph and institutional silence. But silence does not always destroy truth. In 1866, scholars uncovering forgotten monastic fragments found traces of Cromwell's investigations, depositions describing relentless questioning, forced confessions, and missing passages that hinted at coercion. Long-lost manuscripts told a quieter story. Parish ledgers and private letters from terrified clergy confirmed what official records concealed. Elizabeth Barton had not sought rebellion. She was devout, earnest, utterly convinced of her visions. She was destroyed not because she deceived England, but because she frightened its king. The stone walls that witnessed her end remained silent. Yet her story endures, hidden in margins, waiting for those willing to look past sanctioned history. Henry VIII is remembered for his power, his marriages, his religious revolution. But beneath that legacy lies a darker truth. A humble nun once became such a threat that a king risked his soul to silence her. And this is how tyranny thrives, not through armies alone, but through the suffocation of inconvenient voices. For when a kingdom is built on fear, its strength is an illusion. In time, it collapses beneath everything it tried to bury. Today, in the archives of Canterbury and Lambeth, her name appears faintly. Fragile, easy to overlook, but it remains. A reminder that kings may command obedience, but they can never command the conscience of history.